You're listening to Idea Collider, a show that explores the world of asymmetric learning. On this show, I will sit down with pharmaceutical experts and business leaders to discuss how to embrace uncertainty and the different learning style that follows. I'm your host, Mike Rear. Let's get into the show. Okay, so welcome everyone to today's episode where we're diving into the world of biotech innovation with true trailblazer, John Maraganore. Trailblazer was the word that came up next to your name everywhere I looked, John. It's an absolute honor to have you. As a former CEO of Alnylam, you led the charge to turn RNA interference from a bold scientific idea into a transformative class of medicines. 5 drugs now improving lives worldwide, my last count. Your leadership not only reshaped biotech, but also raised billions, created massive value, and inspired countless innovators. Now through JMM into innovation and your work mentoring the next generation, you're shaping the future of biomedicine. Thrilled to unpack your insights on innovation. So welcome, John.
Thank you, Mike. And I'm so flattered by those kind words. So thank you so much. Great to be here.
So let's dive into where it started for you, because you're a first generation American, if my research is right. How does that sort of background shape your approach to innovation and leadership?
Yeah. I mean, despite my last name, which was, of course, bastardized on Ellis Island, I'm 100% Greek. My mother and father both immigrated, from Greece to the U.S. and was born here in the U.S., but lived in a Greek immigrant family growing up. And that was associated with a strong push to constantly do better, with a strong push to go into the sciences and the medical field for my father, and lots of gifts my mother gave me as well growing up. But, an upbringing in the 60s and 70s that was very special. And I'm blessed to have had such wonderful parents that urged me to pursue science and medicine and the like.
So what was that pursuit, university and beyond?
Yeah, so went to the University of Chicago for my undergrad degree, which was close to home. I grew up in the north side of Chicago, but went to the south side of Chicago for school. And I stayed there through my PhD. So completed actually 3 degrees. I got a master's in between, my bachelor's and my PhD, and really amazing school, amazing time to be in the sciences, especially as biotech was just being born during that time. Started school in 1980 and graduated with undergrad in 84. And, that was just the beginning of the biotech, origins with Genentech and Biogen and Genzyme and so forth. So amazing time.
It was. I remember being offered an internship at Amgen in the 80s. And, you look back on what we thought was going to come, and it was nowhere near what actually happened. So
amazing.
It'd be interesting. Let's dig into Alnylam. So you've joined Alnylam in 2002.
That's it.
RNAi was promising, but unproven. A big bet. What gave you the kind of personal conviction to kind of take that bet?
It's interesting. I was in Millennium in 2002 when Millennium was a very special company and very special leader, Mark Levin, to this day, close friend, and always been a mentor for me. But when I got introduced to RNAi and, first was, made aware of it through the founders of Alnylam, but then, was called up in the summer of 2002 by Peter Barrett and Jean-François Formella at Atlas Ventures, who were investors in Alnylam. And of course, I would get calls from time to time about leadership roles. And frankly, I was very happy at Millennium. But as I dove into the science with RNAi, and I thought about the potential for building a whole new class of drugs, I just couldn't walk away from it. I could not let this opportunity pass. And in many ways, it felt as if I were in the late 70s looking at work from Cesar Milstein regarding monoclonal antibodies, and being asked to, lead a company focused on monoclonals, which of course, at the time, notwithstanding the fact that there was no IP filed by Celtech or by the University of Cambridge, rather, it would have been a remarkable period. But I jumped in, I went in, full in to lead the company. And obviously it was an amazing journey, and we could talk about that more, but it was no doubt the right decision. In hindsight, at the time, I knew there were risks, but at the time it turned out to be the right decision.
But a huge kind of strike rate for a company with in a novel technology to get 5 drugs to market. They all became successful.
Amazing.
So that doesn't happen very often, right?
No, not at all. Not at all. What's also interesting, Mike, is this year, 2025, which is the company's 23rd year of life, will finally be the year the company turns profitable.
Oh,
So
really?
it took 23 years to get here. And I recently asked the Alnylam CFO to update me on the figures, but it's about $8 billion of invested capital to
Well,
ultimately get to this point in time. So it just tells you obviously what it takes. And it's based on, building a fully integrated global company, with 5 products that I brought to market and, direct in 20 countries around the world, probably more than 20 at this point, but 20 when I left Alnylam. So incredible journey and so grateful that we were able to do it.
yeah, and I suspect that sort of period of time to profitability is not understood by most of the industry, especially the biotech industry at
No.
the moment.
Yeah, no, I mean, people don't have a sense of that. And, look, I mean, it took Genentech, Biogen, Chiron, Genetics Institute somewhere between 10 to 20 years to
Yeah,
turn profitable, if you look historically. And it took them somewhere between 1 to 2 billion of invested capital to get to profitability. Now, that was back in the 80s with different cost of clinical trials, different inflation, a different time. But, Vertex's numbers weren't different than ours. Vertex was somewhere north of 7 billion to get to profitability and certainly took them, about 20 or maybe a little bit over 20 years to get to
yeah,
profitability. It's just what it takes. It
yeah,
really is.
yeah. Well, I'm be interested in just going off subject, but the kind of biotech environment at the moment is clearly, there's a lot of noise, maybe more noise than music coming through at the
Yeah.
moment. What's your take
Yeah.
on the kind of funding environment?
Yeah, it's horrible. It's absolutely horrible. I mean, I wish I could say we've seen equally bad times, but I actually think this is the worst it's ever been. I've been in the industry now for close to 40 years, and this certainly approaches, I think, the most challenging time. Look, we'll get through this. I have no doubt. We have a very resilient industry, and patients need cures. So as long as that's the case, which is always going to be the case, unfortunately, our industry plays a central role in what we do. But it is an especially hard time. Obviously we've had an inflationary environment, for a few years now, but that's been made worse with the tariffs and how that's impacted the global economy, not just for biotech, but other industries as well. So it's hard. It's a hard time, but we will get through it. There's no doubt about it. And, this industry will continue to bring important innovation forward for patients.
Yeah, and it's a kind of it is also an interesting time as we watch, true innovation coming out of China now, which we
Yeah.
haven't really seen before. And there's a sense that the timelines there are a little bit more, they have longer timelines in terms of their interest in paying back than we're used to. Are you
Yeah.
seeing the world shifting at all?
Look, I'm concerned about that shift. I think the US has been the leader, globally, the leader in biotechnology, and I am genuinely concerned about that. I think it doesn't help that we've had such disruption to the FDA recently. I don't think it helps that we've also had some significant attacks on research institution in the United States. I mean, those are going to be fundamental to continuing our leadership in biotechnology. But I also think it's a call to arms. It's a moment in time where policymakers need to decide if they want the US to lead in this industry.
Mm.
And if they want the US to lead in this industry, they need to think about ways of making the FDA approval process more streamlined and more modernized, not lowering the bar scientifically, but thinking about pathways that can allow us to get drugs to market faster, especially for, very severe life-threatening diseases and conditions. So I'd like to see this as an opportunity and a wake-up call for the US, but if we're not careful, we could lose our leadership here to China. And by the way, in general, I'm a big believer that the approaches that we take to be leaders should not be based on protectionism. They
Mm.
should be based on creating the right incentives in
Yeah.
the end. And I have no doubt that with the right incentives, like a streamlined FDA and a better capital markets environment and so forth and so on, the US will continue to be the leaders in biotechnology. And it's good that we have competition
Yeah.
from other countries in the world, including China.
It's an interesting point that those golden periods of sort of biotech and pharma that you've lived through, had those kind of signals. sitting in them, available. They have money as well, but the US is always stood out. I mean, where you are in Boston is probably
Yeah,
the hottest place on the planet at the moment.
that's right.
And a lot of people sort of look at that and they fail to replicate it. The EU's failed to get anywhere near what the US has done. So,
Yeah.
so do you see Boston and maybe San Francisco again at some point? So,
I think these are cautionary times for, those clusters. I'll tell you one other thing, Mike. I think the hybrid work system is also a risk
yeah,
for Boston and for San Francisco. I mean, after all, if you can live in Costa Rica and effectively work in biotech and, based out of Boston, why not, live in Costa Rica? That's a sentiment you hear out there from time to time. I don't share that sentiment. I'm in an office today working with, other colleagues and trying to advance innovation to patients. But I do think the clusters, the Boston, San Francisco, Research Triangle, San Diego clusters, they're in particular risk of being, harmed by a number of different forces that are out there right now. But, the return to work and hybrid situation is not helping at all.
we see that. I mean, so a lot of large companies are struggling to get people to go back to the office because of, the last 5 years, and the culture is suffering at the same time. So,
Yeah.
they're really having it, as bad as it can be from both sides. But, biotech, I think, is one of those cultural animals that really benefits from people being in the same room, looking each other in the eye when they're arguing about things.
You need it. I can't see how you do it otherwise. I mean, doing what a biotech company does is probably not much different than putting a man on the moon. And maybe it's even harder. And so the fundamentals of innovation and creativity that are fostered by interaction of people is not achievable with a video screen at the end.
Yes, yes. Well, let's go back to before video screens to your sort of hurdles at Alnylam in terms of drug delivery for RNAi.
Yeah.
Can you give me any examples of sort of pivotal moments where, you and the team, looked at what you were doing and changed something to make it happen?
I mean, look, the journey of bringing RNAi-based medicines to the market was, a multi-decade long journey with multiple near-death moments, I would say. And we persevered through many of them. But without a doubt, conquering the science was the most important thing to figure out as a company. And there were lots of challenges. These were, the molecules that mediate RNAi are called small interfering RNAs. They're, relatively large. They're 14,000 Daltons. They're supercharged. They are degradable by enzymes. They can stimulate unwanted immune responses. But most importantly, they have to get from the outside of the cell into the inside of the cell. So this challenge of delivery turned out to be the number one technical hurdle. And we really solved it in a few different ways. I mean, initially, we solved it and brought the first drug to market using lipid nanoparticles, which later have been used in the vaccines, for example, with mRNA. Most people in the world have received LNPs as part of their, vaccine treatment. But then, most importantly, we found conjugate-based approaches that really opened up the door because they were simpler molecules. They were far better tolerated as molecules, and they could be given with sub-Q injection versus IV infusion. And that opened up the door. The other thing that we learned is that these molecules are remarkably durable. I mean, the posology for an RNAi therapeutic can be as infrequent as once every 6 months based on the approved products. And I actually believe it's possible to imagine a world where they're given once a year from a drug standpoint. So these are highly durable, very specific, very targeted medicines that have, a really excellent safety profile when they're designed the right way and tested the right way. And that makes them fantastic drugs, fantastic medicines. And they've really made a difference in patients' lives.
Yeah. And that kind of culture of problem solving, was that a kind of bottom up or top down or both and meeting in the middle?
Both.
Yeah.
It was both. It was both. We had an amazing team up and down the organization, really great colleagues, great, scientists and scientific leaders. But we were a very hands-on organization.
Yeah.
I mean, I would get personally involved in looking at data, the details, and scrumming with the team. I think a little bit of this, Mike, when you're a leader of a biotech company, you can't be a coach who's up in the owner's box, or the football pitch. I mean, you've got to be on the field with your team. Sometimes you have to be, in the scrum. You have to be that close to what's going on. And that's just an important part of it. So it was, getting back to your question, it was very much both directions, up, top down, bottoms up, sideways, every possible way. It was a very, engaged group of people trying to conquer the scientific hurdles to make this happen.
Yeah, and that story of that kind of wave of, entrepreneurial, invested and involved kind of folks, a lot of companies lost that kind of touch. Genentech, some of
Yeah.
the great biotechs lost that as they became more corporate and they
Yeah.
subsumed into larger organizations. Can you keep it going?
I think so. I mean, I'm heartened by companies like Regeneron, like Vertex, and I think even Alnylam under Yvonne's leadership today has got still that very entrepreneurial spirit and focus and science-based culture. I think that's key. But I've seen it happen. Genentech lost it when Roche completed their acquisition of
Mhm.
Genentech. That's when it happened, although they're still a great organization. But I really admire and like the examples of Regeneron and Vertex and the emerging example of Alnylam to scale science-based organizations to continue to sustainably innovate. So I do think it's possible. It's not easy,
Mm.
but it is possible.
Yeah. And that innovation, that sort of definition of innovation as, the creation of value. I mean, Regeneron are a great example of,
Yeah.
seeing, not just the process of developing medicines, but making some money from them too, as part and parcel of the same job.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you don't have a sustainable business if you don't make some money at some point.
Right.
And like I said, Alnylam is only turning profitable 23 years later, just tells you what it takes. And that's with, billions of dollars of sales at
Right.
this point in time. But, that investment in R&D and growing the company is obviously significant and important.
Yeah. And you've written and talked about leading with science over hyper-analysis or financial models, which are kind of my bugbear. How do you balance that kind of rigorous scientific judgment with the practical demands of everything that you just described?
It's interesting. I'm a big believer that, financial and analytical tools are, of course, very important. They're a tool, but they should not be your decision-making
Mm.
vehicle. If you ever think you can make the right decisions with an NPV analysis of a early stage pipeline, you're kidding yourself. There's no way you can forecast, future-based assumptions that are 15 years or
Yep.
even 20 years away at the end of the day.
Yep.
So I do believe that the right type of decision making, especially in the earlier phases of discovery, need to be made by sound scientific judgment and have to be science based, not financially driven and financially based. Have to be focused on the patient at the end of the day. Now, occasionally you have to make the case, which is totally fine and totally legitimate, around the business opportunity, the business case to be made. I think that can be made soundly, by looking at the unmet need and the disease prevalence and, the competitive landscape and, the physician behaviors and
Yeah.
lots of different, important methodologies that people that, know the industry are schooled in. And you can then make a case for how big the market opportunity is for, a program. And that is important for investors.
Yeah.
But I think, when it comes down to it, the real decisions around what's a good idea and a bad idea, especially early, needs to really be science-based and patient-focused.
That's nice. I mean, our approach to early phase decision making, I think, challenges that kind of classic ENPV and risk
Yeah.
adjusted NPV. Because as soon as you start looking at those spreadsheets, someone with a seasoned eye spots all the flaws and the fallacies that
Exactly.
are sitting within there. So you go, well, if you're going to do the same thing on every one of your 100 assets, you're
Yeah.
going to make the same mistakes in all of the way through. Yeah.
I mean, look at the impact on an NPV. If you just extend the LOE by, a couple, 2, 3 years, it has a huge impact. It goes from a negative NPV to a positive NPV. And, we know it's all assumption based and we shouldn't get fooled by that if we're rigorous.
We had a guy who worked with us that was a kind of genius when it came to looking at spreadsheets and the kind of mistakes that people were making.
Yeah.
And I remember him talking to a company once. He'd spotted a flaw in their spreadsheet and he said, look, he said, do you know anyone that's ever launched a drug and had a 100% adherence rate? They said, well, what do you mean? They said, well, can you give me any examples? And they said,
Yeah.
well, no, but it's which other number would you use? And he said, well, if you use 100%, versus 25%, which is a reasonable estimate. They say, well, we can't use 25% because that would kill the forecast. And you go, well, yes, but do you want to tell the truth or do you want to get the program moved forward?
Exactly.
But it really is an issue, especially in biotech, I think, where you haven't had that necessarily sort of, history of making better decisions.
Absolutely. Totally agree. Totally agree. Yeah. Even if you have individuals on your team that have individually in a past life, past company done it before, until you do it as a team together, you haven't done it.
Right.
That's all there is to it.
So let's jump into the other sort of side of that, because you've had over 20 major pharmaceutical alliances at Alnylam.
Yeah.
Which is a kind of a skill in itself. So how does
Yeah.
that kind of strategic partnership accelerate innovation within biotech?
Yeah, look, I mean, we did well over 20 partnerships at Alnylam with major pharma companies ranging from Merck to Novartis to Sanofi to Regeneron to many others. And it was a critical part of building that type of company. I mean, you know, Alnylam was a platform-based product engine where, we could have possibly advanced all the medicines ourselves. There's, the 8 billion we ultimately invested to get the profitability would have been a fraction of what it would take if we tried to, advance everything on our own. So you just can't get there in the capital markets on your own. So you have to find a way to bring in additional capital with additional resources with pharmaceutical alliances. And, plain and simple, that's what we did rather successfully at Alnylam over the years. Some of those partnerships, I would say, were more successful than others. That's natural at the end. But there have been drugs that have been advanced through the hands of our partners all the way to market. Most recently, a drug for hemophilia that Sanofi brought to market globally that we discovered, we invented. Of course, before that was inclisiran that was targeting PCSK9 that the medicines company brought close to market. Then Novartis brought it over the finish line at the end. So, these alliances were critical. Two of our 5 drugs, were ultimately advanced through a partnership, not through Alnylam's efforts. And, that's notable.
Yeah. So is there anything that you would sort of tell yourself 20 years ago about, the nature of alliances and business deals like that?
To me, the key thing is the relationship and the trust. If you've got relationships at the right levels within these companies and you build the right, trust and mutual respect, and of course the science needs to deliver as well. But assuming all that, you can make them very successful partnerships. I mean, I can't tell you the numbers of times in the deal making that we did where the engagement of myself with my counterpart, whether it was the CEO or the head of R&D of a major pharma company, was really instrumental to making it work. I mean, a very, favorite example of mine is the relationship I built over the years, but then ultimately leveraged in our relationship with Regeneron, with Len and George, where, that relationship, that, trust between us was really instrumental in making that relationship successful.
With similar minded individuals there. I mean, deeply committed to the process.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and that helps a lot. If you have alignment of if you both share the same sets of values, it is enormously powerful.
Yeah. On values, so I mean, let's go back to 2020. So you developed an antiviral for COVID-19. That was a big call for a company, like Alnylam to make. What does that reveal about, biotech and its role in global challenges?
Listen, we saw it as an obligation, a moral obligation. We ultimately didn't bring our product to market because we felt that there was enough of the unmet need solved by drugs like Paxlovid, the monoclonal antibodies, the vaccine, of course, as well. And so the unmet need got diminished to the point where, proceeding with the approach that we took, was not going to be the right answer at the end of the day. But we galvanized our resources. We brought teams together during the pandemic to come in physically on site. We prioritized their presence on site at the company to work in the labs to be able to get, this approach, into the clinic, and made sure we protected them from a health perspective. So we did everything we had to do as a company because the world was in a very bad place. And, I think people, tend to forget how bad COVID was in 2020 and 2021. when we had a lot of uncertainty, we had a lot of, unknowns around, where that disease was going and the ultimate, mortality from it, which was beyond, anything anybody would have ever wanted to see. But obviously, if it weren't for the vaccines, if it weren't for the antibodies, if it weren't for some of the small molecules like Paxlovid, we would be nowhere. And, we as an industry did that. We did it remarkably fast. We did it with conviction, and I couldn't be more proud of how the industry responded to COVID. And of course, Alnylam, played a part in that, or tried to help in that in a small way. We also contributed indirectly because of the fact that the lipid nanoparticles that were used in the COVID vaccines, started to some extent at Alnylam. And the work that Alnylam did on LNP discovery turned out to be very useful for the mRNA, vaccines as well. So really amazing that, science and the biotech industry did what it did at that time to take what could have been a very protracted, highly, continued morbid situation and really turn things around in mid 21 into, 22 and beyond. It's incredible.
That's an amazing case study. And as you say, it's only 5 years ago, really, this all started. And we've kind of seemed to have forgotten some of that response that we had, within our, very recent memories.
Crazy.
But I'm interested, because you were chairman of Bio, and at a time of big change in the US, you advocated for policy supporting biotech innovation. What kind of policy changes would you be, advocating for today if you were there again?
Well, I mean, I'm still on the executive committee and so still actively involved, but no longer chair it. We're fortunate to have Ted Love as the chair and John Crawley as the CEO. I can tell you what we believe in strongly. We believe in strong FDA starters. We believe that it's very important that we, rebuild the FDA after the departures that occurred, which are really unfortunate. I think we'll do everything we can as an industry to help Commissioner Macri rebuild the FDA. I don't think people appreciate that, with all the departures that happen, and the people that get hired into the FDA right now will probably shape the future of regulatory science in this country and even globally for decades. A new head of CDER, a new head of CBER, a new head of CDRH, and then key people, below those leaders. And so it is a profoundly important time from a FDA resourcing standpoint. And obviously we are very committed to helping Commissioner Macri in any way, shape, or form to make sure he gets the right best people in there to uphold, the FDA as the scientific gold standard in the world. And so that is by far the top priority, for bio. I think other priorities include making sure, we don't lose sight of the importance of our biomedical research institutions in this country, which, don't affect us in the near term per se, but will absolutely affect our competitiveness in the midterm and longer term. I saw a statistic the other day that showed that for the first time, academic papers published from Chinese institutions exceeds the number of academic papers published by US-based institutions. And to me, that's a very concerning statistic. And it just points to the fact that this might be the wrong time to, slow down our investment in research and NIH funded research. We need a strong biomedical research environment, even at the academic and basic level. Although our industry doesn't count on it in the near term, we do ultimately count on it for the mid and longer term.
Yeah. And that kind of emergence from the chaos is going to be critical, right? I mean, because I think we've all, I think Marty McCurry, he writes well, some good books out there.
Yes.
So I don't think there's any concern necessarily that he's the guy, but as you say, so much of the US's leadership has been based on the principles and the rules and regulations, and this is where everyone wants to launch. So it has to happen.
We also need, for the industry, to see a stabilization of the capital market environment. It is an especially protracted drought, I would say, which, happened due to the inflationary environment under the Biden administration and to some extent has been extended due to the tariff environment of the Trump administration. And, we, like many industries who require, a stable and favorable capital markets environment, are vulnerable. Our industry, of course, is so dependent on capital markets because we, have to raise billions of dollars of capital to ultimately get to profitability, as we
Yeah.
learned from the Alnylam example I shared a minute ago. And
Yeah.
if you have a capital markets environment that's not favorable, that's going to be harmful. Look, I'm hopeful that things will settle down, and we've got a lot of potential and reason to be hopeful. But these are points of concern that
Yeah.
that bio, of course, is trying to help with as much as they can.
And it's been fascinating. We started a lot of work with biotechs and watching if, stock price go down after releasing positive data, and you go, well, yeah, unless someone's in for the 5-10 year ride, it's always going to be a tough time.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but you work with organizations like Nucleaid, you
Yes.
mentor emerging biotech leaders. What does it look like when you're inspiring a kind of young scientist or entrepreneur? Do you still advise them to go into biotech and build successful
I
businesses?
do.
Yeah.
I do. Absolutely. I believe that, one of the things I can help with in this part of my life and career is helping the next generation of leaders be successful. And so I think there's so much potential out there with, young people, or, people earlier in their careers, to develop the skills, develop the experience, to lead the next, many decades of this industry into great success. I do feel strongly that young people should not jump into being a CEO on day one. They should
Yep.
earn their stripes, and they should go work, ideally in a larger company like a Biogen or an Alnylam or Vertex, whatever, and, basically learn about drug discovery and development from, more established companies, and then, grow their career, and then ultimately take on the leadership mantle as they earn it at the end. So I do help mentor that next generation, and I'm really happy about being able to do that. One of the groups I work with closely is the Tremere Foundation, which is the organization that really tries to build on the legacy of Henry Tremere. And one of the things that Henry was known for, without a doubt, is being a strong mentor. He was, for me personally, a strong mentor for the next generation of leaders.
Nice. And I think that we've seen that a lot of that, where the kind of folks going in who don't know what they don't know, or kind
Yeah.
of causing problems for their own companies. But in a lot of companies where really one or two people or three people that were the kind of core of that, challenging each other as much as sort of advancing their science. With advancements like gene editing, AI-driven drug discovery, if we ever see anything come, where do you see the next frontier for biotech innovation? Where's the transformation going to come from in the next 10 years?
I'm very excited about the future of genetic medicines, whether it's gene editing, RNA-based therapies. I think there's going to be an amazing future for RNAi-based medicines. I think RNAi could rival monoclonal antibodies as the, largest growing class of medicines that are out there. So really bright future for that part of the world. I think AI can be incredibly impactful, both in, innovations around target discovery and diseases that are complex, but also in areas around improving drug discovery. I'm not sure, recently Demi Hazabis commented about all 60 Minutes commented about all disease being handled
Yes.
within a decade.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'd go that far just yet,
Yeah.
but I do think there'll be advances that come out of AI-based approaches. Certainly it's a tool that will be extremely useful in our biomedical processes. So I think those are the two areas I'm most excited about, really, to be honest. I also, am quite excited about the area of prevention. I think we spend too much time treating disease with medicines that are, very effective, but, can't we find ways of preventing disease from happening to begin with? Beyond vaccines, vaccines, of course, with infectious diseases are very important and have been proven to be very effective and very safe. But in more common diseases beyond infectious disease, I think there's an opportunity for prevention as well.
Yeah.
And that's a big part of the future. If we can extend our health span as opposed to treating disease when it occurs, that would be an amazing thing for the future.
Yeah. You look at something like Verve's, one shot,
Yeah.
potential preventative for a lot of downstream things. I guess the challenge is the US insurance system, finding a way to pay for those kinds of medicines. That's going to remain a challenge.
Yeah, I think for true prevention to prevail, we're going to have a significant lowering of dish utility. We're going to have, for example, pricing that's commiserate with the prevention paradigm. We can't expect drugs to be priced in 6-digit numbers. If we're really thinking about prevention, we have to have drugs that are priced in the hundreds of dollars, per year at most for true prevention. And I think that's part of the future. Part of that future is innovation in manufacturing. We need to find ways of, lowering the cost of goods so that we can achieve those type of price points. In many ways, Mike, the incretin drugs, the GLPs, are going to help pioneer this future for prevention. And I'm excited about where that'll go. We're only seeing the tip of the iceberg of those drugs and how they can impact health. And I think there are other categories of disease where we can have similar advances as well. But we're going to have to get to pricing and price points where we focus on large numbers of patients at a lower price versus, a very small number of patients at a high price.
And see it when it's there. I mean, I'm sitting in Copenhagen at the moment, a city which has been enriched by the sort of rediscovery of some of that stuff. But as you say, getting to the mass market is unusual for, something that makes as much difference as it does. I realize we're coming up against time, so I'm kind of interested. I know you have JMM Innovation and your board roles, and you're kind of shaping the kind of future of biomedicine anyway. Be interested, let's go forward 10 years. What do you think, 10 or 20 years? What do you want your legacy to be in terms of innovation?
I am passionate about, being somebody as a hardworking biotechnology leader, bringing all different medicines to patients. I think I still like to see another dozen medicines that I've been deeply involved in helping bring to market happen.
Yeah.
At least I think that's doable based on where I sit today. I've got some really exciting companies I'm working with. Some are doing antibody-based therapies, some are doing peptide-based therapies, some are doing RNAi-based therapies. And across that spectrum, I'd like to see at least another dozen medicines get to market and help patients around the world. But some of the things we talked about already, those are my next frontiers, where I've been proudly associated with companies like Alnylam and bringing, RNAi forward. I also think there's an opportunity to have a bigger impact on public health through things like prevention. And that's an area of great interest to me.
Phenomenal. Well, for folks who don't know, I mean, you're almost the number one follow on X, personally posting instead of giving the job to somebody else. Do you see that as a way to communicate with folks?
I do. I don't always love X, I have to say. I think it's become a more toxic environment. I have also created the beginnings of a blue sky presence as well. But it's hard to not avail yourself of that platform and comment on, things that are either going on in the world or the great innovation that's happening across our industry. I mean, leaders need to be willing to speak and to speak out, because I think without it, we can become complicit. So we do need to speak out, and I do speak out on issues that I think I know something about. Not all issues I have views about, but topics where I think I have something to contribute at the end.
Well, and from my side, I really enjoy reading yours and Daphne Zohar's. So many leaders are still using that medium. So.
No, Daphne's got a great presence as well. And you do too, Mike.
Occasionally. I'll post links to all of that with this podcast. But John, thank you so much for this. Time's flown by. Really appreciate you joining me.
Fun conversation and great to see you.
Thanks so much, John.
Great. Thanks, Mike.
That's it for this week's episode of Idea Collider. To continue the conversation, visit our website at ideapharma.com. Follow us in your favorite podcast app so you never miss an episode. Don't forget to rate and review us on Apple Podcast. Until next time, I'm Mike Rea, wishing you great success.